Hey, what's going on, everybody? Looks like we are live, and I'm here with you on Tuesday night, just a few days before the March LSAT coming up this Saturday. So I thought that I would kick things off by sharing some last minute LSAT prep advice for those of you taking the LSAT in just a few days from now. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what to be doing the day before, 2 days before, 3 days before. I see a lot of you coming right in now. Thanks for joining me. So we're looking ahead to the March LSAT in just a few days. Anyone here taking the March LSAT this coming Saturday? Just curious about where you guys are at. Who among you is taking the March LSAT? Who's taking June? Who's taking July? Can I get a show of hands from who's taking each of those test dates? March, June, July. Just leave me a comment there so I know what's going on for you and when you're planning to take the LSAT, and I can orient this conversation accordingly. So for anyone taking in March, I'm hoping to share some words of wisdom, some advice for those of you taking March, and then I'll shift gears and look ahead to June, July, and beyond. We've got a lot of stuff going on in June and July with the transition towards the digital LSAT. So tonight, I'll be sharing some advice on which of those test dates to take and why I think that you should actually consider taking both June and the July LSATs. And even if you are taking March this coming Saturday or this coming Monday, I'm still going to recommend that you go ahead and consider June and July as well, because March is pretty late in the cycle. And so I'm hoping that if you are taking March, that you're taking it with an eye towards applying this fall, rather than finishing off the cycle now, because it's pretty late right now. Let's say we're already at the end of March. If you are looking to start law school 5 to 6 months from now, the issue you're going to face is that the competition's a little bit tougher and there's not as much scholarship money available to you towards the end of the cycle. On the flip side, if you apply at the beginning of the cycle this fall with your March test date, your June or July test dates, or even a September, October, November test date, it doesn't matter. As long as you're applying this calendar year, there are going to be more slots available to you, and there's going to be more scholarship money open to you. And so I wouldn't suggest trying to rush it and get it all done this cycle with the March LSAT. Some people will even take the June LSAT and still apply this cycle with it. There are some lower tier law schools that will take those scores, and even a couple of higher tier ones too. But again, not as much scholarship money available. And so for that reason, again, I would suggest taking it a little bit later and applying for the following cycle, not this current one. But now that a few of you have joined me today, I'm going to jump right in and start off by sharing some thoughts on test day prep whenever you're taking it, just with an eye towards the final week or so. So I've got in mind here some notes to help guide me in this conversation, what I consider to be 7 of the biggest LSAT test day mistakes. And I've grouped them into 2 major categories. One is stress reduction, because test day stress and anxiety are huge factors in leading to what I consider to be test day score drops. And I want to help you avoid those as much as possible, of course. The other category is kind of silly stuff, careless mistakes, things that shouldn't get in the way, but often do. And it's kind of funny. Even if you know the content cold, even if your accuracy is solid, there are a couple of little things that can lead to one of those test day score drops, and I want to help you avoid those. So I'm going to jump right in. I'd say the biggest thing for those of you taking the LSAT this Saturday, coming up just a few days from now, is overemphasizing the importance of this particular test date. Too many people are registered just for the one LSAT ahead of them. So those of you taking March, you might be registered for this exam and this exam only. But what that does is it leads you to place far too much emphasis on the value of that particular LSAT score. I had a great meetup last night with a bunch of you here in New York, and I was talking with one gentleman who's taking the LSAT this Saturday, and he was stressing out about it. He knew the content well. He was actually scoring in the low 170s, and I was really proud to see that. But he was saying that anxiety and stress were eating him up. And I said to him, it really isn't that much money to register for yet another test date. It costs about $190 to register, and of course, it's free if you have a fee waiver. But either way, if that test registration could give you peace of mind. Let's say you're going for March, but you register for June or July in addition. What that does is it takes a little bit of the heat off of you just going for March alone, because you know you have those backup test dates ahead of you. So don't think it's all about this one test. Know you can take it again in June or July and beyond if you need to. And if you can afford it, even just getting that registration taken care of now, having it booked, knowing that no matter what happens, you do have June and July ahead of you, will help you remember that it's not all about this one test. While the LSAT as a whole is extremely important, no one test date in particular is especially important. So know that, especially with the LSAT being offered more and more frequently all the time, we've now got 9, 10 test dates a year. There are plenty of opportunities to retake just around the corner. There's always another test date just a month or two away. The next thing I want to help you think about is, in terms of stress reduction, is letting go. I don't want you to get stressed about or get stuck on one particular question or even a section when you've already moved on. So let's say you're on game 4 and game 3 gave you a lot of trouble. It's eating you up. You want to be able to let go of what happened on game 3 and move on to game 4. And of course, that's easier said than done. But remember that you've bubbled in your answers. You flipped the page. It's not going to help you, of course, to think about what's going on with game 3 if you're not actively working on it. This is where mindfulness and focus come in. You want to train yourself to focus on the task at hand and let go of what came before. It's easier said than done. It takes some practice, but even just now with only a few days remaining, I want to encourage you to set aside even as little as 3 to 5 minutes a day, just focusing on your breath, focusing on the task at hand. Whenever your mind wanders, acknowledging it, admitting that it happened to yourself, because it's okay, it's natural. But the moment of recognition that your mind wandered, the moment when you bring it back, that's the same muscle memory. That's the same strength you can bring to task when it comes to letting go of a previous question and moving on to the following one. Which brings me to the third stress-related technique that I want to help you with to reduce your stress, is to avoid getting bogged down on tough questions. It's natural, but you don't want it to be the end of the world. Typically, when I'm going through a timed logical reasoning section, I'll actually skip 3 to 5 questions in the section, even me, and I do well. I got a 175, but I'll still skip 3 to 5 tough questions in the moment because I don't want to get bogged down on them. I know that I'm throwing good time after bad, and I really don't want to risk getting stuck in a kind of LSAT quicksand because it's tough. It's not easy. And these lengthy questions are worth the same as the shorter ones. Everything's worth just 1 point. But if a question is taking up half the page, if it's an incredibly lengthy parallel question or principal application question or something on a difficult topic like philosophy or science, where I know that I'm not likely to make a lot of headway in the moment, what I'll do is I'll flag it, I'll skip it, and hope to come back to it later. And by the time I get to the end of the section, I'll typically have 3 to 5 minutes remaining, and I'll be able to use that time to go back and handle the 3 to 5 questions that gave me the most trouble. Those of you just coming in, do me a favor, leave me a comment letting me know when you're taking the LSAT and what's giving you trouble, and I'll try to orient this conversation around that. Now, I wanted to move on a bit to some of the silly stuff that can get in the way. One of the biggest stupid mistakes or silly things that I see people do is they walk into the test center with a government ID that does not match the name on their admission ticket. Maybe there's a misspelling on one of the two. Maybe someone got married and changed their last name. Any and all of those things can actually get in the way of the proctors letting you into the test. It's silly. It's ridiculous. Obviously, your photo matches. Everybody knows that. But rules are rules. The proctors are very much by the book, by the letter of the law, kind of like future lawyers. Haha. And so what you want to do is you want to double check that now. Go online, go on LSAC's website, and check that your government ID matches exactly what's on your admission ticket. And if it doesn't, reach out to LSAC now, call them, email them. Their email is lsacinfo@lsac.org. Reach out to them and try to get that solved and squared away now. It's Tuesday night now. You still have 3 full business days to solve this issue. And so make sure you do it now. Don't wait till the last minute on Saturday morning when it's already too late. The other silly mistake I see really often is waiting till the end to bubble. Proctors will usually give you a 5-minute warning, but they don't always give you that 5-minute warning. They're humans too. They can screw up. And so you don't want to count on their warning to remind you that you have to go ahead and bubble now. So there are 2 ways to deal with this. I like bubbling question by question. I consider it to be a kind of mental reset that reorients me towards the following question, lets me clear my mind of what came previously so I can move on. The other strategy is to bubble game by game, passage by passage, or LR 2-page spread by LR 2-page spread. So typically you'll have 9 to 10 questions per 2-page spread. So you could do all of those, then bubble, then flip the page and continue. Either way is perfectly fine. I like to bubble question by question because it has a slightly higher accuracy rate, but whatever works for you is good. Again, I would practice this now. I wouldn't wait until test day to implement a new bubbling strategy. And that goes for anything in general, really. And that brings me to the next point in terms of silly mistakes is when people try out something new on test day when they've never done it during a timed practice test experience. Test day is not the time to experiment. It's not the time to try something new. And you've still got a few days. You can do timed sections tonight. You could do timed sections tomorrow. You could do them Thursday. I would recommend, of course, taking the day before off. Leave that as a relaxation and rest day. Don't do any serious studying then. But you could do, let's say, depending on where you are, you could still fit in a timed section or 2 tonight, then do a full-length timed exam tomorrow or Thursday, and then once again, take the day before off Friday to completely rest. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of silly mistakes is letting other people at the test center stress you out. And those could be people in the waiting area, the lobby of the test center, whether it's a high school, a college, a law school, listening to them and chatting with them. And you might think that could reduce the stress a little bit. I think it could potentially enhance it. Other people are kind of a wild card. You never know what they're going to say, what little thing they could do that could end up kind of sending you down a rabbit hole of despair. Sometimes people will brag. Sometimes they'll say things that aren't even true. They'll troll you a little bit. People like to often undersell how much effort they've put into this exam. It's kind of an ego thing, I guess, maybe for some of them, but you don't need that negative energy. You don't need that stress. So I recommend typically going off in a corner, focusing on yourself, bring a newspaper or a magazine, or maybe a warm-up question or 2, maybe a favorite game, maybe a favorite passage or a logical reasoning question or 2, just to warm up your brain. You could do it at the test center before you walk in. You could do it at a coffee shop nearby. You could do it in the car. But I would, of course, once you walk in and sign in, they're going to make you throw out all that stuff. But it's a good way to get your brain warmed up before you start. But again, avoid other people. Don't let them stress you out. And same goes during the test itself. If other people seem to be going faster or slower than you, ignore them. They could be doing something different. They could be on a different section. You might have games at the moment. They might have reasoning at the moment. And so what they're doing has no bearing on you. They could even have a different experimental altogether. Or maybe their pacing is not good pacing. Maybe they are going too fast or too slow relative to what they should be doing. You don't know anything about them. Just because they have glasses doesn't mean they're smart. So definitely keep that in mind. Just try to focus on yourself and what you're doing in the moment. So anyway, those are some of my biggest pieces of test day advice. On the other end of things, I want to talk a little bit about simulating test day conditions. A lot of times people will be getting great practice test scores, and then on the exam itself, they experience a drop of 3 to 5 points or more. And that could be due to stress and anxiety, but it could also be because the practice tests they were doing were not under realistic conditions. Sometimes in the comfort of your own home, you might be a little bit generous with the timing. You might give yourself breaks. You might go, instead of 35 minutes, go to 40 minutes. You might not be bubbling during that 35-minute period, or you might be snacking or taking a break between sections 2 and 3. You might check your answers after every single section. I know I used to do that because it's very tempting. You want to get that instant feedback, but of course, on test day, you're not getting the instant feedback and you're doing all 5 sections back to back with only a short break between sections 3 and 4. And so if you're doing your practice tests under more benevolent conditions, under easier conditions, then of course on test day when it's more strict, you're going to experience a drop. And so you want to make sure that during your practice, whether you're going for March or June, July, and beyond, that every single practice test you do, whether it's only one more this week or doing one every single week for the next 2 to 3 months, that you're doing your timed practice tests under conditions that are as realistic as possible. So those of you going for March, take a timed exam tomorrow or Thursday, review it, then completely rest on Friday, then walk in Saturday and kill it. So for more LSAT test day prep advice, I'm going to send you a link to a YouTube playlist I put together with a bunch of advice, several different videos and webinars and other Q&A sessions where I've gone over all my test day prep focused advice in depth. I'll put it in the chat here and I'll link it to the description below this episode later for those of you who want to check that out. Now, I want to move on a little bit to those of you who are taking the exam in June, July, and beyond. Now, are any of you thinking of retaking? I know that retaking has become more common than ever, and so I think that retake advice is particularly timely at this point. I recently taught an online class focused exclusively on retaking, where I shared 15 LSAT retake strategies in 15 minutes. I'm going to share the recording of those in the chat as well, and I'll put them in the description for this episode later for those of you who are watching the replay. Now, for those of you going for June, July, and beyond, my advice is actually that you take both June and July. And you might think, why would I tell you to take July as well if you've been planning on June? Because maybe you won't need July if June goes well. The thing is that law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only consider the highest LSAT score. And so for that reason, there's never really a downside to retaking. And previously, retaking would mean that you were studying for an additional 2 to 3 months back when the LSAT was only 4 times a year. That's no longer the case. Now the LSAT is 9 to 10 times a year. And so the July LSAT is only about 5 to 6 weeks after the June exam, which means that if you can stay fresh on your LSAT studies for that additional 5 to 6 weeks, you could potentially improve your score by just a couple of points, doing nothing more than staying fresh on the LSAT. Now, you might think, how do I know I'm going to do better? You don't, and you might not. The funny thing about the LSAT is that there is a kind of score band or margin of error of 3.5 points on either end, which means that you could get a 167 one day, a 174 the next day, and the LSAT is still a perfectly valid test. That's the funny thing. Your true aptitude might be a 170 or a 171, but you have a good day, it's a 174. You have a bad day, it's a 167. And so let's say you take it in June, you get a 170. Through nothing more than blind luck, you could retake it and get a 174. And a 174, of course, will open far more doors than a 170 will. I actually found this study recently that showed that the value of an additional single point on the LSAT is another $4,000 of value. And that's another $4,000 of value in terms of maybe getting more scholarship money or getting into a better law school. And so the ROI on that is huge. More scholarship money, another $5,000, $10,000 a year over the course of 3 years, or getting into a top 14, the career opportunities that opens are enormous. And so if all that requires is staying fresh on the LSAT for another 5 to 6 weeks, it's well worth it. And even if things don't go any better on the July LSAT, you still have your higher June score to apply with, and law schools don't care that you did better or worse the next time around. Again, they're only considering the highest score. Now, whether you're retaking or not, you want to focus on your weak areas no matter what, because there's your starter studying where you focus on building your foundation first, focusing on your accuracy, untimed, then your pacing with individual timed sections, and then endurance with full-length 5-section exams. So that could be a mix of games, reasoning, and reading comp all along the way. I recommend focusing on one area at a time, but still doing the others to stay fresh just the same. In addition, I recommend, of course, cycling in one full-length timed exam per week. If you're working full-time or you're in school, that'll typically happen on a Saturday or a Sunday. Then you spend the remainder of the weekend reviewing it. And then throughout the week, you do a timed section or two here or there. You do some foundational work, maybe reading an LSAT textbook, maybe reading some articles on my site, watching some YouTube videos, listening to some podcasts. But the most important thing of all is going to be detailed review of everything you got wrong and had difficulty with. A lot of times, students will review only the questions that gave them trouble, only the ones they got wrong, but they forget about the ones they got right. A lot of times you're down to 2 and you're guessing, and it's 50-50, of course. But let's say you got 10 of those 50-50 wrong, the other 10 you got right. If you just mark them off as right and you move on, you're not actually gaining anything from what you did there, because there is something to be learned, because it just as easily could have gone the other way next time around. So I want you to review everything where you have even the slightest glimmer of doubt, because the LSAT does repeat itself again and again and again. This is not a test of content. This is a test of pattern recognition. And so if you are falling for a question that exhibited a particular pattern or a particular trap, you're in trouble. You want to make sure that you're spotting what exactly that pattern was, what that trap was in the method of reasoning, in the stimulus, or in the question stem, or in the answer choices. And you want to review it and understand it in depth so that you don't make the same mistake again. There's a review process I want to quickly summarize for you here. And that involves determining whether your misunderstanding in the question was in the stimulus, talking about logical reasoning, or in the answer choices, or in the question stem. Now, if your mistake was in the stimulus, then of course you need to more thoroughly understand the method of reasoning. You want to break it down. You want to paraphrase it. You want to put it in your own words. Maybe you want to explain it to a friend. Maybe you want to explain it to an LSAT tutor or friends in a study group. Maybe you just want to write it out by hand, or maybe you want to type it out. Maybe you want to post it on a forum, but forcing yourself to articulate it, to take it out of your head and speak it out into the world, or put it down on paper, make it physical in some way, I think is really important, because it's too easy to look at the answer key or look at an explanation and say, oh, I get it now, and then move on. That's not where the growth comes from. The growth comes from actually thoroughly understanding exactly what you got wrong and why. What trap LSAT laid for you. That's the only way that you're going to avoid making that same exact mistake in the future. And it's not fun. It's grueling. And it can make you feel really dumb sometimes to see exactly what little silly mistake you fell for. But you shouldn't necessarily feel silly about it, because that's LSAT's job. Their entire goal, their entire purpose in creating this exam is to lay traps for you. Traps of encouragement towards wrong answer choices, and traps of discouragement away from right answer choices. And so during your review process, you want to see if it was a trap in the answer choices, like what I said, or if it was a confusingly worded question stem, or if it was in the stimulus. And even in the stimulus alone, there could be 5 different tricks they're laying in the exact same stimulus. And maybe you're able to avoid falling for 4 out of those 5. But if you fall for even one of those 5, you're going to get the question wrong. And so you got to figure out which of those 5 traps you fell for and why. Now I'll just list now a couple of ways they tend to ramp up the difficulty of LSAT questions, particularly speaking about logical reasoning. They might require you to link together multiple conditional statements, and they might not lay out those conditionals in a clear logical progression. They could lay it out as being something like A requires B, then C requires D, and then B requires C. So you have to rearrange those to be A arrow B arrow C arrow D. Now that isn't so bad, but what if they add on the complexity by requiring you to take the contrapositive? So instead of saying A then B, they might say not B arrow not A. And so you got to do the contrapositive, then link things together, even though they were in an undesirable or confusing order. Then to the next level, they could include words like unless, except, until, and without, which are not clearly necessary condition indicators or sufficient condition indicators. They're something else altogether. And so lots of manipulation that you have to do. And then, of course, there's also the topic. It could be on science. It could be on philosophy. It could be some sort of counterintuitive method of reasoning. One of my favorite recent examples of this is actually from an older exam, but I've been bringing it up a lot lately. It's from test 38, section 4, question 18 or 20, something like that. But it's about a doctor who is a smoker and wants to ban smoking in public places. And you might think that's a very strange situation because why would a doctor be smoking? Doctors are supposed to be healthy, right? That's our expectation. But in reality, doctors are not necessarily exhibiting perfect behavior. Doctors do sometimes smoke, and that's just their behavior, so be it. That is permissible in the real world, even if it's not what you'd expect. Then secondly, this doctor who was a smoker wanted to ban smoking in public places. This is very strange because why would a smoker want to ban smoking? You'd think that a smoker wants smoking to be permitted everywhere. But just because that's what you'd expect, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And so these strange or unfamiliar methods of reasoning could very well occur. And so you've got to be very careful to spot each and every one of those things. Anyway, let's see what else. So let's say you're going for the June or July LSATs 2 to 3 months out. If you are working or in school, like I said, you're doing maybe one-timed exam on the weekend and then lighter studying during the week. I'd recommend typically 10 to 20 hours per week for those of you who have other obligations. And that's reasonable. That's enough. Don't feel like you have to burn yourself out. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And that is especially true for those of you who are not working or in school, those of you who are fortunate enough to be studying full time. So if you're in that situation, you run into the opposite problem. You're not in the situation where you have to carve out time before work, during lunch, or after work. If you are studying full time, you really do run the risk of burnout. And so in that case, what I want to do is I want to make sure that you're orienting everything else in your life around your LSAT prep, but you're still carving out time for what you need. So maybe you wake up at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, you shower, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, work out. Then you study maybe from 9 a.m. till 12 p.m., take a break for lunch, then study again from 1 to 4 or 1 to 4:30. That is enough. That's 6 to 6.5 hours of studying. That is more than enough. Any more than that would lead to burnout, especially over a 2 to 3 month period. So carve out time for socializing, relaxing, eating well, exercising. You have time to do all of that, but relaxing in the evenings. On the other hand, if you're working or in school, then maybe get to work an hour early, carve out some time in a conference room or at your desk before everyone else shows up, and do a time section or two, or read some articles or do some other practice problems. Then during lunch, maybe you find a half hour or an hour, or maybe if you have some downtime at work, you read some articles on my site, you watch some videos, or on your commute even, listen to some podcasts. I've got 2 podcasts, the LSAT Unplugged podcast and the LSAT Pros podcast with my buddy Graham Blake. And so definitely check those out. They're in iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and so on. And they're a good way to fit in some LSAT content studying, even passively, while you're on the go. Now, no matter what your situation is, I want you to take this exam seriously. I want you to treat it as if it were a 6-credit class or as if it were a part-time job. It's serious, and I find that a lot of times people get discouraged because they don't really realize just how grueling this exam is. For so many of us, myself included, this exam ended up being a lot more than we expected. You know, like many of you, I thought I'd be able to do it in 2 to 3 months and be done with it, especially because I was good at school stuff. I was good at academics. And I thought that I was going to rock this exam. But then lo and behold, I took my first diagnostic and I got a 152. And I was incredibly discouraged because I had gone to a top undergrad. I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school. And then that was a really rude awakening to score right around the median. And so it took me a long time, much more than 2 to 3 months. It actually took me a full year of studying this exam, doing every single LSAT released, every single book I could find, even over the course of an entire year before I got my 175. And so this was a lot more than I bargained for. It's a lot tougher than the GRE or the GMAT or the MCAT or even the SAT, because like I said, this is not an exam of content. You can't cram it. You can't memorize it. It's a test of a way of thinking, and it really does require a massive mindset shift, a kind of transformation in your way of thinking, to be critical and skeptical, to not simply take things at face value. And so if it's taken you more than 2 to 3 months, you're not alone. I recommend for most people they take at least 5 to 6 months. This exam is worth it. If you think about it, your undergraduate GPA took you 3 to 4 years or more to get to, but the LSAT is weighed more heavily than that in the admission process. Yet it all comes down to one day, to 2.5 to 3. And so it really is worth that investment of 5 to 6 months. And I find that the people who tend to do best on this exam do give it at least 5 to 6 months, and they do at least register for 2 or 3 LSAT test dates over a longer period of time. So if you've taken it and didn't get what you wanted, you're definitely not alone. Pretty much everybody who came to my meetup last night in Brooklyn, there were like 10 or so people there, every single one of them was retaking the LSAT. It was nobody's first go at this. Everyone had at least taken the exam once or twice. And I can see from my email list, I can see that people have been on my list for 3, 4, 5 years or more, continuing to study for this exam, especially if you're working or you're in school or you have a family. Those other obligations, they really can eat up a lot of time. And so if they've required you to postpone your test date or to withdraw or delay, that is the norm. It's becoming more common than ever, especially since law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. There really is little reason not to retake if you think you could do better. And law school admissions is conducted on a rolling basis. And so you can always take it again and apply later in the cycle. I know I said earlier that you don't necessarily want to apply at the end of the cycle, and that's true. But at the same time, law schools are keeping applications open for longer and longer periods to see who else comes along. And so if you do apply at the end of the cycle or you do have a longer timeline, that's perfectly okay and normal. And so to help you structure your studying, I've got some LSAT study schedules here. I'm going to link for you in the description for this episode here in the chat. If you want, I've got week by week ones, I've got day by day ones to help you orient your study for any study timeline from 1 month through 7 months. And I've also got retake schedules as well. Now, I'm wondering, for those of you taking in June and July, your level of knowledge or awareness about the digital LSAT. Has anyone looked at the digital LSAT familiarization tool? It's kind of an interesting little gadget they have there, doing it on a tablet. And it's at familiar.lsac.org for those of you who haven't checked it out. It's kind of worthwhile to play around with there. I'll just type it in the chat for you all. It kind of walks you through what the tablet format is like. It's definitely worth checking out. It's definitely different than what I expected it to be. And I think that one of the biggest things about it that struck me as being kind of surprising is that you cannot draw freehand on the digital LSAT, even though it's a tablet. And I kind of always thought the entire point of a tablet is that you can draw on it the way you would on a piece of paper, but on the digital LSAT, you can't do that. So be aware that if you're taking the LSAT in June, it's going to be paper and pencil guaranteed, just as it always has been. The only thing digital about the June LSAT will be the writing sample. The writing sample on the digital LSAT will be separate. You won't be doing it at the test center. You'll be doing it separately on your own time later that day or in the coming weeks or months. Keisha, I saw you took the pilot. I'm curious if you could share your thoughts with that in the chat, just what it was like for you, because I know that some people have had kind of mixed results with it. But starting in July, like I said, the digital LSAT, the LSAT will be going digital. Half of test takers will get the digital format. Half will get the paper and pencil format. LSAC chooses for you, and you don't get any advance notice at all. So I wouldn't want to personally be in that situation, but for those of you who are a bit more tech savvy and tech comfortable than I am, maybe that's not a big deal. But I do want you to know that you're going to be walking in, maybe getting the paper, maybe getting the digital. And so if that is you, if that is your situation for July, then I would suggest getting a tablet of some kind. LSAC is using the Microsoft Surface Go, so you could get that, but a more affordable option would be the Samsung Galaxy tablet, which is like a couple $100, maybe $200-$300. And that's a lot of money, of course, but it really is a drop in the bucket if it gets you even one more point on the LSAT by helping you feel more comfortable with what the digital LSAT will be like. If your smartphone is one of those big ones with bigger screens, then that could be a decent substitute, maybe. So play around with it. The digital LSAT familiarization tool is mobile friendly, so you can do it on an iPhone, on a Samsung, on one of those Google Pixel phones, on any kind of tablet, and you can also try it out on web, desktop as well. I did a recent podcast episode with my friend Graham Blake on the LSAT Pros podcast, episode 8, which was where we shared all of our thoughts on the digital LSAT. I'm going to put a link for you guys about that as well if you want to check it out. I've also got a playlist on YouTube sharing all my thoughts on the digital LSAT, different pros and cons, different features, walking through what it looks like with the highlighting, underlining, the countdown timer. Yeah, one thing you should know about it in particular is the countdown timer. It's a 35-minute countdown, but once you hit the 5-minute mark, you're not able to remove the countdown timer. So that could be a little bit stress-inducing, possibly. The plus side, though, is that you won't have to rely on the proctors to give you that 5-minute warning. It'll automatically show up for you on the tablet. So that's something to check out there. One other thing you should know is that the digital LSAT will give you scrap paper. And so if you're used to not having scrap paper, doing everything on the booklet in very tiny writing, then things have changed. You will be able to draw separately on your scrap paper. And so you'll have to go back and forth between the tablet and the scrap paper. So get used to doing this on a small desk. You never know what your test center is going to be like. And yeah, just keep that in mind that you have to go back and forth. And so you have as much space as you need to diagram logic games or diagram specific questions or make markings on the side. But for example, reading comp, you can't draw freehand on the passage. You have to use LSAT's tools in particular. So once again, check out that familiarization tool I linked there. It's definitely good to have a sense of what you're going to be facing on test day. And the Khan Academy, by the way, does not replicate the digital format. Just because the Khan Academy is digital and is online and is in partnership with LSAC, that doesn't mean that their format replicates what you'll see on test day. So just keep that in mind. Now, I know I've said a lot, been talking for over 30 minutes straight here. I would love to take any and all questions you all have for me tonight. Just leave them in the chat window here, and I'll get to as many as I can before I have to go out and walk the dog. One other thing I can share with you is that I recently did an interview on the LSAT Unplugged podcast with a former NYU law school admission officer. And so that came out yesterday on the LSAT Unplugged podcast, episode 46. I'm going to link to it in the chat here if you want to check it out. She did a great job giving some amazingly useful pieces of advice, useful tips there. And so I would definitely recommend that you seek out her advice on there. I asked her a wide variety of questions on everything related to the law school admissions process. I also posted our discussion on YouTube, and so I'll share a link to that as well if you want to check that out. Really great advice and great tips there. So yeah, I'm opening this up to questions now. I'm happy to answer anything at all you guys have for me about the March LSAT, June, July, and beyond. Anything substantive related to LSAT and law school admissions, anything on games, reasoning, or reading comp. Happy to share anything at all. One question I got about LSAT study schedules: what's the difference between the day-by-day and the week-by-week? So the day-by-day plan is basically more detailed. It's more specific about every single thing you have to do every single day over the entire course of your LSAT prep. And so week-by-week schedules only give you a general outline of, okay, do games this week, do reasoning that week, do reading comp this other week, and I'll link to some various articles on my site. But then the day-by-day plan, tells you exactly what to do. So it'll tell you, read these pages in these prep books, read these articles on my site, then complete these exact LSAT problems out of these exact LSAT prep tests, then take these days off per week, because again, I don't want you to burn out. So I do factor in typically one or two, actually definitely at least 2 days off per week, every single week. And I do want you to take those off days. And people will say, well, you know, I work odd hours, or I only work some days, or maybe I work on weekends. How should I take advantage of your schedules given that? And so I'll say the schedules are more important for the level of specificity they offer about exactly what to do than for their particular day-by-day breakdown. And so let's say you couldn't study on Monday, day one, when I had some work assigned. What I'll do instead is I'll say, okay, well, load up on day two then and day three. So maybe you don't do anything day one, but you catch up on the following couple of days and make up for it. Again, the schedules are more important for the level of specificity about what to do, because I think that a lot of the problems we face with LSAT studying is that there's all these old exams, there's all these textbooks out there. How do you pull it all together? And so I want to remove the ambiguity for you by telling you there's a system involved. Again, it's accuracy, then pacing, then endurance. So I start off by taking logic games. I take the easiest logic games type, which is typically ordering games or sequencing, depending on your terminology. And I'll say, start with the ordering games, start with the easiest of the ordering games. Read these chapters in these books, then read these articles on my site, then complete these exact practice problems from these exams. And typically I'll recommend using exams 52 to 61 or 62 to 71 to start with, then going forward to the more recent exams in the 70s and 80s for your full-length prep. And now that people are retaking more often than ever, the biggest piece of advice I want to share with you is don't do all the new exams now. If you're taking in March or you're taking in June, you might want to save a handful of the exams in the 70s and 80s to do closer to test day for your retake if you need to. Because again, people are retaking more often than ever, and you don't want to burn through all the recent material. You do want to have something available to you for the retake if you need it. So I hope that answered that question. I see I've got one here from Ed. What's the best way to learn logic games? The best way is to dive right in. I was talking with a student earlier, and she was saying she was having trouble with logic games, didn't know why. And I said, well, how many games have you done? She said she'd done about 3 or 4 exams worth of games. Now, 3 or 4 exams worth of games is only 12 or 16 games altogether. Now, we've got about 320 or 350 released logic games ever. And so 12 to 16 is nothing. That's really nothing at all. There are far more games out there available to you. And there are enough types of logic games and enough twists they do in logic games that doing just a dozen or so is not nearly enough to expose yourself to the wide range of possibilities out there. And like I said earlier, the LSAT is about pattern recognition. You are not trying to reinvent the wheel on test day. Imagine if the first time you ever tried to do the contrapositive was on the day of the exam itself. It might not go very well. And that's not because the contrapositive is hard, but because it would be your first time seeing it and your first time trying to translate it. And so the same goes for many, many other things on the logic game section. Too many to get into now, but the point is that you want to go through it systematically, covering all the major types. And so what I recommend doing is using the schedules, go bit by bit. Easiest ordering games, then medium difficulty ordering games, then the toughest ordering games. Then you go on to grouping. Do the easiest grouping games, the moderate grouping games, then the difficult grouping games, then the combination games, then the rare games, then the curveball games. So you do them by type. I have categorizations of all the logic games on my site. And once again, they are linked in the study plans. So once again, I'm giving you the link to the schedules, the study plans, if you want to check them out, where I really do break it down bit by bit. Then the next thing I'll say is you want to redo logic games multiple times. Doing the same game 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, it's not too much. Back when I was studying for the LSAT, the most recent book of exams was exams 29 to 38, which makes me feel really old because we're now at exam number 86. But the benefit there was that I was using that same book of exams again and again and again, both while I was studying myself and then while I was teaching the exam to others in the early years of my career. And so I had the chance to do these games in the 30s hundreds of times, literally hundreds of times. I did the same games again and again. And it was crazy. I knew the games cold like the back of my hand. But the benefit was that I started getting new insights into the games the more I did them. And so even my 10th attempt, my 20th attempt, my 30th time walking somebody through that game, helping them see the hidden insights, the hidden tricks that would unlock the game, I increased and deepened my understanding of those games. And so the redoing the games is enormously valuable. And I want to make sure I get to some of these other questions here. Katie says, thoughts on the writing sample? Well, in general, I think the writing sample is not that important. So my advice would be don't focus on it. Law schools do not, of course, the writing sample is not scored, so law schools don't really care that much about it. Numbers really are the biggest factor in admissions. The writing sample is not really worth studying for. You could look at what sample one if you want, just to see what it looks like. But basically, you're given a dilemma or a choice between two things. You want to make an argument in favor of one of them and argue against the other, but still acknowledge the weaknesses of your side. So pick a side, argue for it, but be balanced and fair in your approach to your argument in favor of what you're choosing. One thing I can mention is that the writing sample is going digital in June, so you won't be doing it at the test center when your brain's fried. Instead, you'll be doing it from your computer, probably at home or at the library, and they'll be watching you with a webcam and a microphone, kind of like I'm being watched by all of you right now. And they're only going to look at the recording in the event that something is off or they have concern over test security. They'll have you kind of hold up your ID in front of the camera to kind of show that really is you doing it. But I think that's really more just to make sure that it is you completing it if they have concerns about someone's English fluency, especially if they're a non-native speaker. But I wouldn't really stress too much on the writing sample. I think that maybe law schools will look at it a little bit more than they used to, just because it'll be typed on the computer, so it'll be a bit more legible than if you had written it out by hand, again, when your brain's fried after doing 5 LSAT sections. But I wouldn't really stress too much about it. Justin's asking, will the September LSAT be administered all digital or half paper, half digital? Great question. So the July LSAT is kind of a transition period. It's unique in that that'll be the only time that half of students get digital and the other half get paper. So that's a one-time thing. The other thing that's special about the July LSAT is that they'll let you see your score before deciding whether to cancel. They're doing that kind of as an olive branch or as a bonus to help with the ambiguity and the stress of transitioning to the digital format. But I don't really think that's that big a deal because, like I said, law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. And so for that reason, there's not really ever a reason to cancel unless something went astronomically wrong. In 99% of the cases, I would suggest not canceling. So I don't really think that aspect of July matters. But to directly answer the question, Justin, the September LSAT will be all digital. And so if you do want to do it guaranteed on paper, June will be your last chance to do that, assuming you're not taking the LSAT in March, of course. Now, Patricia's asking, when is all digital expected? Or Keisha was asking me, when's all digital expected? That was, of course, September, it'll be all digital. Patricia's asking, any idea if they'll reuse past LSATs for June or if it will be a completely new one? That's a great question. I'm honestly not sure. I think that since LSAC is, of course, administering the LSAT much more frequently than they used to, they are in a strange position where they do have to reuse a lot of old test forms. And so chances are probably that they will reuse an old test form, but the old test form that they reuse will be something that was also previously not released. And so you will not have seen that exam form before, unless maybe they administered it overseas in the past, or it was the Sabbath Observers Administration in the past. So it could have been a reused form, but it's not as if that exam has been a numbered exam that you can study, of course. That would obviously compromise the security of the exam altogether. And so it's not really that worth thinking about that much, in my opinion. Now, Patricia's also asking, how much time, a couple of months or weeks after we take the LSAT? Not sure entirely what you mean by that. You get your score back typically 2 to 3 weeks later. For the July LSAT, they're actually suggesting that they won't give you your results back even as soon as they typically do. So typically, you get your LSAT scores back about 3 weeks later. But because of this transition to the digital format, they'll likely take longer than 3 weeks to get it back to you. And so on their website, they're saying that the score release date is to be determined, meaning that they're not making any promises when you'll get your score back. And so I would definitely focus on other things if you're taking the July LSAT during the second half of July, because you probably won't get your score back until, I'm guessing, early to mid-August. So I'd use that time to instead focus on other aspects of the admission process, like your personal statement, getting your letters of recommendation in order, everything else of that nature. These are great questions. I'm glad that you all are so active and engaged and aware of what's happening in the field of law school admissions during this LSAT transition time. I'm curious how you all are thinking about the digital LSAT. Is this something you're looking forward to, something you're in favor of, or something that maybe you're not that much looking forward to? Personally, I'm kind of torn on it. I think there's some benefits, some drawbacks. I think the highlighting and underlining functionalities are pretty smooth. I like that you can resize the text as you want to. I like that on the reading comprehension part, they automatically highlight the line reference or the vocab word they're referring to in the passage, so you can automatically go exactly where you want to in the digital LSAT on the passage. I think that's kind of a cool feature. But again, like I said, I don't love the countdown timer. I think it's kind of stress inducing. Excuse me. And I don't like that you can't draw freehand on the tablet. And so my wish list for the digital LSAT would include allowing you to draw freehand on the tablet, to kind of draw freehand or draw loosely on it as you want to with the stylus. But, I think this is just version 1.0. I'm hoping that in the future, they'll take some of the people's feedback into account, work out some of the glitches for the next time around. I think this partnership with Microsoft has sped things up, of course, but I think there's still definitely some room for improvement. Let's see, Chester's got a comment here. I think digital's good. That way, we can gauge on what to do. And if you've got to take the test again. Yeah, I do think that digital is good in that way. My favorite thing about it is that you can flag questions very easily and see that if let's say you flagged question number 4 or question number 17, you can automatically click back to it. You don't have to kind of flip through all the pages, and then maybe you flip too far or not far enough, or you tear the page, or the proctors have a doubt about whether you're working on the correct section. So I do like that you can click around precisely to exactly where you want. I think it's kind of a cool feature. Marx is asking, do you have a timeline or steps regarding the admission process, like when to complete what? That's a great question. I think that my biggest advice on admissions timelines is take the LSAT early so that you have chances to retake it if and when you need to. So if you're looking to take it in March or June or July, that's great. I'm glad so many of you are watching now and taking time out of your Tuesday night, at least if you're in the US, to devote this time to the LSAT, because you're early, assuming that you're applying this fall. You've still got, like 6 months or 5 months till applications even open. And so if you take it in March or June or July and it doesn't go well, you could take it again in September or October and still apply at the very beginning of the cycle. And in terms of the other stuff, I'd say letters of rec, request them soon. If you're still in college, request your letters of rec from your professors this semester, so they have all summer to work on it and you have all summer to harass them on it. And then, of course, you can follow up later. You can get those letters squared away, ready to submit at the very beginning of the cycle in the fall. Personal statements, I'd say work on it anytime over the summer, really work on it as a break from your LSAT studying. I think the best writing takes place over a long period of time. And so if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 months to work on it, you have plenty of time to do a rough draft, put it away for a week or two, come back, revise it again, show it to friends and family, show it to people on Facebook, people on LinkedIn. I had a great discussion with a Columbia Law student who shared with me that she actually networked with alums of her law school, or her Gold Law School and her undergrad, on LinkedIn to ask them for feedback. And they actually gave her feedback on her PS. And so if you have a couple dozen eyes on it, that's a couple dozen tips and pieces of advice, suggested edits to help you review and revise it to make it as good as possible. So I think starting early with all of this stuff is a good idea. Same goes for optional essays and addenda, diversity statements, etc. I think overall, in terms of timeline, just get it all done so that by the time your scores come back, you're ready to go. And so if you're taking June or July, you'll still get your score back even before applications even open. So you'll have all of July, all of August to work on all of this stuff. And of course, you have that 3-week gap before you get your scores back to work on everything. And even that alone really could be enough. Let's see what else. And also, Marks, one last thing. On my website, if you go to the free stuff tab, there's an admissions portion where I actually have laid out precise timelines and study plans for the admissions side of things. So definitely check that out as well. Let's see. Keisha said, I've never taken the paper LSAT, but I did find it easy to navigate, the digital one, I assume. So yeah, that's good. And I mean, the paper one, if you want to try it out, just go to LSAT's site or Google June 2007 LSAT, And you could print it out. And of course, if you're taking in June, you're going to want to do that. I think a lot of people who are studying these days are doing too much on the screen if they're taking the paper LSAT. And so I recommend getting a printer or going to Kinko's or FedEx, whatever, and printing out your LSATs or getting the book of 10 exams. It's only $20 on Amazon to get one of those books, and it's well worth it if you're taking the LSAT in the paper format, of course. But you do want to practice like you're going to take it. And so if you're going digital, of course, different story. In that case, if you have the PDFs, I would definitely recommend using those and doing things on the screen and having a notebook or scrap paper on the side. And he's asking, how many times can you take the LSAT during a year? Is it as many as there will be LSAT exams? Great question. And it's changed. It used to be the case that you could only take the LSAT 3 times in a 2-year period. And I think that's because LSAC wanted to suggest that taking it too many times wasn't a good thing, perhaps. And that's also an artifact of back when law schools averaged multiple LSAT scores, in which case maybe you didn't want to take it too many times. But since then, of course, things have changed. Now law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest. And so LSAC, maybe being a bit of a bureaucracy, they were slow to change their rules. And recently, maybe due in part to competition with the GRE, they've removed these restrictions and now allow people to take it as many times as you want. So the short answer, Ani, is that you could take the LSAT as many times as you want, as many times as they're administering it. You could take it 3, 4, 5, 6 times. I think taking it more than 6 times starts to look a little questionable, like maybe you're not taking it when you're ready. So it raises some questions there. But overall, I think taking anywhere from 3 to 6 times has now become totally normal. And so if you've taken it a couple times or you have a cancellation on your record, I wouldn't worry. No big deal. Since schools don't average multiple scores, it's definitely worth your while to retake it if you think you could do better next time around. Let's see. Jackie's saying, I'm considering studying for the LSAT this summer and want to take the exam in the fall. What are your thoughts and advice for seeking a private tutor? Great question. So you're taking the LSAT in the fall. You've got maybe 6 months between now and then, plenty of time. So I'd say if you're just starting off your studying now, it might honestly be a little bit early to seek tutoring. Maybe you want to build your foundation first. Maybe you want to gain an understanding of where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are, so you can go out to that tutor and say, these are the exact areas I'm having the most trouble with. You can walk in prepared and ready to go. For my students, I'll say, bring me the 3 to 5 hardest LSAT problems you've recently encountered. That could be a game, a passage, a tough LR question, whatever it is, bring it to me and we'll solve it. I'll also say, bring me your 3 to 5 biggest mindset or conceptual questions. That could be a certain question type. That could be related to pacing or endurance or anything at all related to study timelines or logistics, which exams to use, whatever it is, bring it to me and we'll get those answered for you. Now, you want to come prepared. You want to know that your LSAT tutor is using real LSAT exams. You want to know, of course, that they've taken the LSAT themselves and that they can relate to you. Back when I was studying for this, I got a tutor. And honestly, he was one of those natural born geniuses who just kind of gets it. And he made me feel really dumb because he would just say, oh, it's easy. You just do X, Y, Z. And he'd kind of sprint through it, solve it in 2 seconds. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense now when you do it. But I don't know how to replicate what you did. It's easy when I'm there with the person, but then when I was on my own, things would fall apart. And so I think you really want to find somebody who can relate to you, who's been through the process, and can look at the way you're actually thinking about the problems rather than regurgitating or lecturing some perfect solution. A lot of times you'll go online and you'll watch videos or you'll read explanations and you're seeing some tutor's perfect way of doing things. And of course, that's the ideal, but believe me when I tell you that that's not how they necessarily did it the first time they looked at that problem. Like I was saying earlier, I got really good at this when I could do the same game 20, 30, 40 times because I could see it from every single angle. But when my students walking through the game for the first time, I have to throw all that previous knowledge away and just look at how they're solving it in the moment. What diagrams are they drawing and where could they have maybe done it better? Or maybe where do they misunderstand something that I can help them see it a different way? And so I think you want to definitely look at multiple options. Don't think of only one person. And don't necessarily limit yourself only to your geography. A lot of times people will be in some random area of the country, maybe not a major city, where there are not a lot of options. And so definitely consider going online. Most tutors these days are also willing to do Skype or Hangouts or Zoom, or even just over the phone, whatever, or FaceTime, whatever it is. But definitely look for the person who's the best fit for you, not necessarily the person who just happens to be in your area. A lot of times somebody will go on Wyzant or Craigslist or go to their local law school and find some law student who's doing this on the side. And that person might be affordable and might be decent, but you got to ask yourself whether you have more time than money, because someone who's been doing this full time and has the experience could maybe get you there faster, even if their hourly rate's a little bit higher. And I also say now that with the internet, there's a lot of free stuff available. And so you can go online and find people who've put out content on the LSAT. Maybe they've done videos or articles or webinars or what have you. And so you could actually look at what they put out there, watch them, listen to them, see how they think, and decide whether it's a good fit given your learning style and their teaching style. I was talking with somebody yesterday who was saying, well, why should I choose you over somebody else? And I'm saying, it's not my place to convince you. I work with people who want to work with me. And so look at my YouTube, look at my podcast, look at my articles, and then decide if it's a good fit. And this person hadn't actually looked at any of my stuff. And so I said, I'm not going to sit here and try to argue for why you should choose me. You know, I'm happy to work with you if it might be a good fit for both of us, but I don't need to work with you either. I want to make sure that we only pursue this if it's a good fit. And so look at all the free stuff first. Then if you decide that it feels good to you, then let's talk. And if based on that, if I think that you benefit from working with me and I feel like I could help you, then we'll explore it from there. So anyway, Jackie, I hope I answered your question. If not, of course, feel free to ask follow-ups. Justin's saying, I'm not looking forward to the digital LSAT. I'm worried I'll see a decrease in my score from my practice test average since all practice tests are on paper while the exam is digital. I definitely hear where you're coming from, Justin. And I share that concern as well. And especially since I've been doing it on paper for over 10 years now. And I have gotten some exposure to digital just from using PDFs more and more, just given their convenience. And so I'd say my recommendation for you is if you have access to the PDFs, study using PDFs. Study with LSATs on the screen since that's how you'll be taking it. And of course, the June 07 LSATs on PDF, and LSAT also has some other sample questions on PDF. That familiarization tool is also on the screen, of course, so you can use that. And depending on how you're studying, you might have access to all the other PDFs as well from old exams. And so I definitely recommend, again, doing those on the screen, having your notebook and scrap paper to the side so that you can practice more closely to how it'll be on game day. Let's see, got a question from Marks here saying, now my last question is, when will the break between sections be given that the writing portion is online for the June LSATs and beyond? This will help when I take time prep tests. Thanks again. Yeah, sure thing, Marks. Happy to help. So the break on the LSAT will be just as it was before. The break is between sections 3 and 4. So you could have games, reasoning, reading comp, then a 10 to 15 minute break, then let's say games and reasoning again. And then of course, in that case, games would have been one of the experimental sections. So the break is always between sections 3 and 4. The writing sample has no relation to that. The writing sample is going to be at the end no matter what. And of course, going ahead to June, it won't even be while you're there at the test center, it'll be later, but that does not affect the break. Anyway, folks, we've just about hit an hour now and I should go walk the dog soon. I'm happy to answer any final questions you may have. Otherwise, I'll sign off. I got this last one here from Jordan. I'll answer before we go. Let's see. Do I think she lists some resources, then says, do I think it's worth investing in a tutor, or should I diversify the books I'm reading more first? If you've already got a couple of books that you're using and those books are using real LSAT questions, you don't necessarily need to go beyond those books. The one addition I would suggest is to use, of course, real LSAT prep tests. So if you're using some textbooks, you're using the actual LSAT exams, that alone is enough to help you identify some weak areas. Once you have found those weak areas, then I would say jump ahead from there, seek out the tutor, find your areas of concern, bring to your tutor, bring them the 3 to 5 hardest problems you've encountered and the 3 to 5 biggest mindset or conceptual questions that you have so that you can make the most of your time with them. Because otherwise, a lot of tutors will just start lecturing at you from square one, giving you the foundation on every aspect. But you don't want to necessarily hire a tutor to teach you the entire curriculum when you can read it in a book or watch it in videos for much, much less, or even free if you're using my YouTube channel, for example. So for that reason, I'd say ask them the sort of nuanced questions that you can't get answered elsewhere from reading an explanation or watching a video. Ask them the things that you've looked around already and could not find the answers to, where you'll benefit from their interaction and they're taking a look at your personal thought process. That's the biggest piece of advice that I could give, because over the years, I found too many people coming to me just kind of saying, I'm having trouble with games. What should I do? And that requires a little bit of parsing out what their thought process is. And so if they can find that out for themselves first, that's great. That saves us some time. If not, though, because I've been doing this for a while, what I'll typically do is I'll ask them some nuanced questions about different game types. I'll maybe have them walk through a game or two in front of me, or I'll have them record themselves doing a game, then send me the video, and I'll watch their pen on the page to see how they're doing it. And then maybe I'll see some areas where they could have solved it more efficiently. So I hope that answers your question, but I think that you've armed yourself well enough so far. And so I'd say that you're good to go ahead and seek out the additional help. Anyway, folks, it's been about an hour. I should go walk the dog. Anyway, I appreciate all of you for coming out here tonight and in making the investment in yourselves and in your LSAT prep to set yourselves up for success whenever you're taking the LSAT, whether it's March, June, July, or beyond. Please feel free to reach out if you need anything at all. You can email me at lsatunplugged@gmail.com. Please check out the YouTube channel at youtube.com/LSATblog, and also check out the LSAT Unplugged podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play, as well as the LSAT Pros podcast in addition. So anyway, folks, all the best to you on the LSAT whenever you're taking it. I'll be staying in touch with you via email and in the Facebook group, the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group, that is at facebook.com/groups/LSAT Unplugged, for future online classes and Q&A sessions and in-person meetups, both in New York and elsewhere. So again, thanks for joining, everyone. All the best to you and take care. Have a good night.